I told you that the right to vote, one of the most fundamental rights in a democracy, has been under attack for decades? And not just decades, centuries. And what if I told you that the attack isn't over? Today, we're talking about the fight for voter rights, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and how a single Supreme Court case, Shelby County v. Holder, made it harder for millions of people to vote. Let's get into it. First things first, why did we even need a Voting Rights Act? Well, the origins of voter disenfranchisement go back to the very first presidential election. The 1790 census indicated there were about 4 million people living in America. A little over 2 million were free people, with about 700,000 slaves and around 150,000 Native Americans. Yet, only a little over 38,000 people voted in the 1789 election. That's only 1.3% of the population. Less than 2% of the U.S. population decided who the country's first president would be. Why so small, you ask? Because voting rights only extended to white land-owning men, Catholics, Jews, Quakers, African American slaves, women, and Native Americans did not have the right to vote. That, paired with poll taxes and literacy tests, made it impossible for any other demographic of persons to participate. Now imagine that. Voter suppression has its very origin in the establishment of the United States. Now let's fast forward a bit. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, technically gave Black men the right to vote, but the South wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. They got creative, and by creative, I mean downright sinister, with ways to keep Black voters out of the polls. Literacy tests that were impossible to pass, poll taxes that many couldn't afford, grandfather clauses that said if your grandfather couldn't vote, neither could you, and of course, straight up violence and intimidation. Now fast forward to the 1960s, and these tactics were still going strong. Enter the Civil Rights Movement. On March 7th, 1965, hundreds of peaceful protesters marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, demanding voting rights. They were met with tear gas, clubs, and state troopers beating them down. That day became known as Bloody Sunday, and it shocked the nation. This was the final straw. A few months later, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was one of the most powerful civil rights laws ever passed, and here's why. It banned racial discrimination in voting nationwide. No more literacy tests, and no more nonsense. Section 5 of the Act created what's called preclearance. This means that states with a history of voting suppression, mostly in the South, had to get federal approval before making any changes to their voting laws. And Section 4 of the Act established a formula to determine which states needed preclearance. There were immediate results. In Mississippi alone, voter turnout among Blacks increased from 6% in 1964 to 59% in 1969. For decades, this law protected Black voters and dramatically increased voter registration in the South. But then came 2013 and Shelby County v. Holder. Let me introduce you to Shelby County, Alabama, a county that did not like the federal government checking its voting laws. Shelby County challenged the preclearance formula in the Supreme Court, arguing that it was outdated and unfair. And guess what? The Supreme Court agreed. The ruling, Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, the formula that determined which states needed preclearance, was unconstitutional. And with that formula, Section 5 became useless. In simple terms, the government could no longer stop states from passing new voting laws, even if those laws targeted Black and minority voters. And what happened next? Exactly what you may think. Texas, Alabama, North Carolina, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and countless other states have enacted repressive voting legislation that has the purpose and effect of impeding the right of Blacks and minorities. Voter ID laws were passed, requiring forms of ID that many Black, elderly, and low-income voters just didn't have. Polling places in Black communities were shut down, forcing people to travel further and wait in longer lines. Voter rolls were purged, removing thousands of registered voters for no reason. Now let's be real. Voter suppression never disappeared in America, but Shelby v. Holder made it easier for states to do it without consequence. In her article, Eviscerating the Voting Rights Act and Moral Authority, Professor Patricia Broussard discusses the terrible message that this case sends not only to American citizens, but to the world as a whole. By eviscerating one of the most powerful laws enacted to ensure and preserve the right to vote for minorities, the United States has not only sent a message to Blacks and other minorities about the value of their citizenship, but it has sent a message to the entire world about holding itself to the same high standards that it requires of other nations. And most importantly, it has sent a message on American-style democracy that might be distasteful to most and certainly not to be emulated. So where do we go from here? For years, lawmakers and activists have been trying to restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act was introduced in Congress to bring preclearance back, but as of today, it still hasn't been passed. Meanwhile, more states are making it harder to vote with stricter voter ID laws, limited early voting, and mail-in ballot restrictions. Gerrymandering has weakened Black political power. The fight for voting rights isn't over. So here's my question to you. First, are you registered to vote? Check, like right now. Do you know your state's voting laws? Because they change all the time. And are you sharing this knowledge? Because when people don't know their rights, it's easier for those rights to be taken away. And with 3 critical special elections on the line in 2025 and midterms in 2026, voter registration, education, and participation are more critical than ever. Voting rights are still under attack, so what are we gonna do about it? Let me know in the comments. Stitch this video and let me know if you have a personal experience with voting suppression or intimidation. And next class, we're talking about modern day voting battles and how you can fight back. See y'all then.